Hey guys, in this series, Mariano5 and myself are going to discuss 10 very common leaks we've spotted over the thousands of combined hours we've played at the live cash games, along with what we can do to avoid them and immediately increase our win rate.
Yeah, that's right, and we're also excited to announce that we have an entire Raise Your Edge course coming out in early 2019, which is focused solely on crushing the live games. In the course, we'll be expanding on all the concepts in the series, plus everything else you'll need to be successful at the live felt. But for now, let's get into the leaks. Alright, here we have leak number 3, continuation betting too wide in multi-way spots. So as the game has evolved over the years, everyone is starting to understand the power of the c-bet. It's obviously very effective in a lot of spots, but many people take it way too far as well and are just blindly c-betting on all types of boards against multiple opponents. And this is definitely not going to be the most effective strategy. We can start here with bluffs. So, as I said, continued aggression is definitely good, and players are definitely getting better at this. But the reality is, in these live cash games, you're just not going to have enough fold equity in these multi-way spots to be bluffing super wide. We need to understand that we're playing against a combined range, and as well as playing against very loose players. So if we're betting weak hands and weak draws, playing against this combined range, and then playing against players who hate to fold, we're going to have very little fold equity. We're just going to be losing money in the long term. So it's a really fast way to just start dwindling your stack. If you're just always applying these c-bets and hoping to get them through, it's just not going to happen. So we definitely need to have a better approach than that. What's going to end up happening as well is that you end up in so many marginal spots on the later streets. You're going to end up in bloated pots with a pretty wide range. Oftentimes you're not going to know what to do. I mean, most times. So you're going to think maybe I should keep bluffing, and then you kind of get yourself in a situation where your only way out is to keep bluffing and trying to buy the pot. And again, in these games, players really don't like to fold, so you can end up losing a ton of money that way. Also, the fact that if you're c-betting and getting called in multiple spots, then there's a good chance that at least one of the players has a pretty strong range. Again, we're playing against a combined range, so by the time you get to the turn and river, often you're up against a very strong hand, so the likelihood of getting your bluffs through is obviously diminished. And then again, obviously we're playing against the players who don't like to fold anyways. So overall, it's just going to be a very dangerous strategy to be trying to bluff too wide in these multi-way spots in these games. Moving on to the value portion of our range now. The main idea is that we end up value owning ourselves way too often if we c-bet too wide in these spots. So when you do get calls by one or more players, you're just going to be behind too often, and it's going to make your c-bet unprofitable in the long run. Again, we're playing against combined ranges. We always need to be thinking about this, and people can have a lot of good holdings post-flop. So even though they might be playing weak ranges pre-flop, that doesn't mean they still can't smash the board post-flop. Similarly to when we are bluffing, we're also going to end up in a lot of bloated pots on the later streets with marginal value holdings if we're not careful. It's easy to compound our mistakes as well. Once the pots get bigger, we can become attached to our hand and start justifying making big call downs. Obviously this can become very expensive in the long term. So for example, 4-way to a flop, and we continuation bet with ace-10 suited on queen-10-4. Now, if we get called in one or more spots, let's say a blank hits the turn, we're going to be pretty lost. We're not going to have a good enough hand to keep betting. We're going to be up against Queen X very often, or maybe some good draws. So it's just going to be a tough spot on the later streets there. It's going to be a better idea just to pot control on the flop, if possible, and keep the pot small. It makes it easier to get to showdown quite often as well. And then lastly, we're going to be missing a lot of free information when we are out of position if we just blindly continuation bet with a super wide range. Because in many spots, if we just instead check, maybe somebody behind us ends up betting and he gets a call or two, maybe somebody even raises him. so we feel like our hand is not strong enough to continue, and we make the fold right away on the flop. Obviously in these spots we're going to be saving a lot of money long term, and this can definitely add up. We can have a look at a couple of example hands now. Alright, so 1-3 game here, and we have the ace-king offsuit. Very easy raise, of course. And we get called in 3 spots. All these guys are loose players, so we can definitely assume they are on very wide ranges. It's a good spot for us, of course, up against 3 weaker players with a very strong hand. We see the flop. Now we figure we should continue our aggression here. Maybe we can get some folds. Maybe some good things can happen on the turn of the river, so we go ahead and bet here about half pot. But again, if we think about their ranges in terms of a combined range, these guys can hit this board very often. They can have all the 4x, all the 7x, lots of queen x, pocket pairs. They can have all sorts of draws with diamond draws, gut shots, open-enders. So realistically, we're not going to have much fold equity on this board at all. And when you are betting with a semi-bluff, you do want to have some fold equity. So in this circumstance, playing against weaker players, it's going to be a much better idea just to bet a very value-heavy range. And then with our bluffs, we pick our best bluffs. So obviously we're going to have some good diamond draws here we could use. Even a hand like ace of diamonds, king, or ace with the king of diamonds. Although that's pretty marginal bet, it would be a lot better than this, because at least in that circumstance we can barrel on diamond turns a lot and put on pressure. But in this spot, there's not going to be too many good turns that we can barrel. Obviously the ace or the king would be good cards, but you can get into a lot of trouble if you start trying to barrel wide against calling stations. And also, if we do check here, we can gather the information from the players behind us. Quite often it's going to get checked through anyways, so we can see a free turn. Sometimes we can make delayed c-bets on good cards, take it down in that spot, or obviously we can hit our hand. So it's going to be a good idea here just to try to keep the pot small and just really don't try to push your aggression against calling stations. Next hand we have the ace-8 suited. Same position, we go ahead and raise it up. A couple loose passive players call from behind, and a random player in the cutoff. Tight passive player defends. So once again we're up against wide ranges. The tight passive player should have a pretty reasonable range though. We see the flop, pretty decent. Top pair, of course, it's checked over to us. Now we figure we have to start betting right away for value. So we lead out here for a little over 2/3 pot. But once again, we need to be thinking in terms of a combined range. We are up against 4 players, and although the board is pretty dry, we can be ahead fairly often. These guys can also certainly have stronger hands, especially the tight passive player in the big blind can have a lot of strong ace-x. And another problem with betting here is that if we do get called by 1 or 2 players from behind, it's going to be very tough to continue on the turn with a bet unless we hit an 8 or an ace. So we're going to be pretty unsure of what to do, and by that time the pot's going to be fairly big. So for our overall strategy here, it's going to be a good play just to check. We can see what develops, we can gather the information. Oftentimes it's just going to be checked through as well, and we can start betting on the turn and the river for value. There's also some other reasons why checking here is going to be the better play. I'll get into those in just a minute. So that brings us to our solution. The main idea is just to tighten up our c-betting requirements and be a little bit more selective and patient. Of course, this is pretty obvious, and it's also a pretty general statement, so we can get more into the details here, things we should be thinking about. With our bluffs, for starters, we want to be assessing our realistic fold equity, and then on top of that we want to be thinking about our immediate equity, so how good is our draw, and then also what type of backdoor equity we have, what type of turns can give us good cards to bluff on. So if you're in a spot where you think you have no immediate fold equity on the flop, there's just no way they're going to fold, then it's totally fine just to check our whole bluffing range. We can simply bet all of our value hands. We're not going to get exploited. They're still going to be calling with very wide ranges, so it's not a problem. You don't need to be balanced. If we do think we have some fold equity and we want to start betting some of our draws, then we always want to pick our strongest draws. And of course, the more people there are, the stronger our draw should be. So this is our immediate equity. So for example, we see a flop with king queen offsuit, and the flop is 10-7 ace. There's also a flush draw present, and it's four-way. In this spot, we only have a gut shot, and even though we might have some fold equity, we can pick better bluffs, such as flush draws, that will double the amount of votes we have compared to just a gut shot. And there's also going to be times where we have both a straight draw and a flush draw, which is even better, so you definitely want to be selective in these spots. We also want to be thinking about how the board interacts with the combined range of our opponents, always. So, for example, we raise ace-jack, and we see a flop of 8-9-10, and there's a flush draw present as well, and we're six-way to a flop here. So we have a decent draw, but the fact is this board crushes our opponent's ranges, so we're basically going to have no fold equity on this flop. Realistically, we should be checking a huge portion of our range here. And if we do want to bet some bluffs, we want to have very, very strong bluffs, so basically only straight draw plus flush draw type bluffs that can really just afford to get it in on the flop, even if somebody raises and they just have a ton of outs. Because if we think about our value range in this spot, we're only going to be betting two pairs and sets. We're not going to be betting over pairs in this spot because there's just too many players and they connect too well with this board, so we really don't want to have any bluffs, if any, on these type of boards. And then thinking about backdoor equity, we always want to be thinking about how many turns are going to give us additional equity. If there realistically aren't too many turns that will give you too much equity, then we can start checking our bluffs as well. So for example, we have king queen offsuit and it's four-way, and we see a flop of 6-3-8 rainbow. Now in this spot, obviously the king or the queen is going to give us the best hand quite often, but other than that, there aren't any cards which are going to give us additional straight or flush draws. So it's totally fine to check this spot as well. If you have backdoor flush draws, so for example, let's say the 8 was the heart, and we have king queen of hearts, that definitely makes it a bit better of a bet. It's still going to be a very loose bet, but at least in that case, you're going to turn a flush draw. Occasionally, it's going to give you both actual equity, and then you can also use that equity to create fold equity by applying pressure. But in this case, we just want to check on the rainbow board. Even a hand like Jack-10 suited with a backdoor flush draw, while not being an ideal bluff, especially four-way here, it would be a lot better than the king-queen offsuit, just because of the backdoors. So obviously the 7 and the queen would give us the gut shot on the turn, the 9 would give us the open-ender, and then obviously if we turn one of our flush cards, that would give us the flush draw, so there would be a lot more turns we could barrel in that case. But as I say, if there really aren't too many turns that you can barrel, especially when it's multi-way, then it's better just to check on the flop. We always want to be thinking about future streets. Now with our value hands, the main thing is that we always want to assess how many streets of value we can realistically get with our hand. If we think we can only get 1 or 2 streets maximum, then it's often better just to check the flop, especially on dry boards. There's going to be a bunch of benefits to this, so you don't always need to start betting your mediocre hands on the flop. You can always get value on later streets. We strengthen our checking range a lot when we do this, and this is very important because especially if you're playing against more competent players, if they know that every time you check you're super weak, then they can just barrel you off. But if you do have some pretty good hands in your checking range, it's going to be tough to play against you. It's also going to induce bluffs, so there's going to be a lot of times where if you bet, they're going to fold all of their air, obviously, but if you check, a lot of players think that they can just bluff you off every time, so they'll bet at least once. As I said, we can always get value on the later streets as well, so it's not a problem. So yeah, we don't want to be blindly betting all of our top pairs. This is the main thing. So, for example, we raise with the king 10, and it goes 5-way to the flop. King 3-6, rainbow. This is a perfect spot to start checking our king 10, because we do want to have some strong hands in our checking range. We want to have some king X. So in this spot, we're thinking about hands we can get 3 streets of value with. It would be something like king queen plus, possibly king jack in some weaker games. But if you think about it, if you bet flop, bet turn, bet river, you're not going to get called down by too many worse hands unless the player is a complete station. So we do want to be careful with our more mediocre holdings, and as I talked about above here, there's a ton of reasons why it's going to be better. What we're going to end up doing is dividing our value range on the flop into medium strength hands, which we end up checking almost always, and then our strongest hands, which we can bet almost always if we feel like we can get 3 streets of value with them. So it does take a bit of practice, but always just think about your entire range overall and then start categorizing which type of hands you want to put in your checking range and which type of hands you want to put in your betting range. It does take a bit of practice, but the more you do it, the easier it gets, and it's going to create a much more sound strategy and better long-term results. We also always want to be thinking about how much protection we need on the flop with our medium strength hands. So the less protection we need, the more often we just want to check these hands. So for example, if we have pocket 8s on a 2-2-4 board and it's 4-way, even though with our 8s we're probably only going to get 1 or 2 streets of value, we still want to bet here because we do benefit a lot from protecting our equity. There's going to be a lot of turns which are overcards, which can either give the players the best hand or kill our action, so we definitely just want to bet here. But alternatively, if we have ace-5 suited and it's 4-way on an ace-2-8 rainbow board, this is a totally fine hand to check, just because we don't need much protection here. Obviously, players can spike some 2 pairs and sets, but other than that, it's going to be tough for them to come from behind. We also benefit from them actually spiking, say, a pair of kings or queens on the turn, and then we get additional money from them on later streets. So this is definitely another benefit. Alright guys, so that's been it for leak number 3, continuation betting 2 wide multi-way. I hope you've learned something here today and can apply it to your game. The main thing is just to stay patient and be very selective with both our value bets and our bluffs. It's going to be very tough to play against us as well if we have well-constructed checking ranges. So yeah, hopefully you guys have good luck at the tables, and I'll see you next time. This has been Mariana5 for Raise Your Edge.